February 20th, 2025, Carrollton, Georgia. A pre-dawn 911 call shatters the heavy suburban silence. 16-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick is on the line, her voice a jagged edge of terror, reporting that her parents have been shot. When deputies arrive at the Brock home, they find a scene of calculated carnage, James and Christine Brock cold in their bed. Miraculously, a 5-year-old girl is found alive in the house, unharmed but a silent witness to a nightmare. The tragedy of a double murder is only just beginning, and the primary suspect is already holding the phone. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. The head of the family, James Brock, was a man whose very existence was a testament to modern medical technology. James suffered from a severe heart condition that required him to be tethered to a left ventricular assist device, or LVAD, a mechanical pump that helped his weakened heart move blood through his body. This device was not just a medical necessity, it was a constant, audible presence in the home. The LVAD emitted a rhythmic mechanical hum and was equipped with a series of alarms that would trigger if the power supply fluctuated or if James's vitals dipped into a dangerous zone. For those living in the house, the sound of James's heart was literally a machine, a sensory anchor that reminded everyone of his fragility. Christine Brock, his wife, was the engine that kept the family running. She wasn't just James's primary caregiver, she was the disciplinarian, the financial manager, and the moral compass. In the eyes of the Carrollton community, Christine was the ideal mother, deeply involved in the Tabernacle Baptist Church, a woman who balanced the immense stress of a husband with a failing heart and the demands of raising a teenager and a 5-year-old daughter with outward grace. Then there was Sarah Grace Patrick. Sarah wasn't James's biological daughter, but for years, the distinction seemed irrelevant to the outside world. She carried the surname of her biological father, Charles Patrick, but it was James who provided the roof over her head and the structure in her life. Sarah was, by all public accounts, the perfect Georgia teenager. She was a bright student, an active member of the youth ministry at her church, and someone who seemed to thrive under the weight of her family's high expectations. Her social media profiles were curated to reflect this, filled with photos of church events, family outings, and the kind of wholesome content that would make any parent proud. However, beneath this veneer of Southern piety, a profound psychological rift was forming. The history of Sarah's upbringing was marked by a bitter, protracted custody battle between her biological father and the Brocks. For years, the legal system had been a background noise in her life, a constant tug of war that left her feeling like a prize to be won rather than a person to be understood. While James and Christine aimed for a life of structure and traditional values, Sarah was increasingly drawn to a world they couldn't control, the digital landscape. As she entered her mid-teens, the pressure cooker of the Brock home began to hiss. James's illness meant the house was often quiet, dictated by his rest cycles and medical needs. Christine's response to the family's stress was to tighten the reins on Sarah, monitoring her phone, setting strict curfews, and demanding a level of transparency that Sarah felt was suffocating. To Christine, this was protection. To Sarah, it was a declaration of war. Sarah began to find solace in her digital persona. She became obsessed with social media influence, carefully crafting an image of herself that was independent of her burdened home life. She started reaching out to her biological father, Charles, behind Christine's back, seeking an ally in her quiet rebellion. The tension wasn't characterized by explosive shouting matches, but by a chilling, silent detachment. Sarah would sit at the dinner table, a model daughter on the surface, while her mind was miles away, calculating her escape. The dynamics of the home were further complicated by the arrival of the 5-year-old sister. In the eyes of Sarah, the young child represented everything she was being forced to protect, and everything she felt was being prioritized over her own happiness. The contrast between the vibrant, needy child and the dying, mechanical heart of the father created an atmosphere that was emotionally exhausting. Sarah felt trapped in a cycle of caretaking and performance, a role she hadn't chosen and one she was no longer willing to play. By the end of 2024, the facade was beginning to crumble. Those close to the family noted that Sarah's inner glow seemed to have dimmed. She was more withdrawn, her responses more clipped. She spent hours in her room, the blue light of her phone illuminating a face that no longer matched the girl in the church choir. She was no longer just a teenager rebelling against her parents. She was a girl who had begun to view her family as obstacles to the life she believed she deserved. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not end with an argument, but with the metallic scent of gunpowder and the sudden violent silence of a heart pump failing in the dark. The silence in the Brock home was never truly silent. It was filled with the rhythmic, mechanical wheeze of the LVAD machine tethered to James's chest. For Sarah, that sound wasn't a comforting sign of life. It was the ticking of a clock in a room she couldn't leave. Every beep, every adjustment of the batteries, every periodic alarm that signaled a drop in power was a reminder that the entire household revolved around a man who was fragile, and a mother who used that fragility to enforce a regime of total transparency. Christine Brock ran the residence with the precision of a high-security facility. It wasn't just about curfews or chores. It was about the fundamental ownership of Sarah's identity. In the months leading up to the incident, the atmosphere in the Carrollton house had shifted from structured to stifling. Christine's anxiety over James's health had curdled into a controlling impulse that targeted Sarah with surgical intensity. The woman checked Sarah's phone logs with the regularity of a prison guard, scrutinized her choice of clothing for church services, and monitored her social interactions with a skepticism that bordered on paranoia. To the congregation at Tabernacle Baptist, this was seen as a mother's devotion, a fierce effort to keep her eldest daughter on the righteous path, while the family navigated the shadow of James's terminal condition. But behind the closed curtains, Sarah felt she was being erased. The silent war was fought over the blue light of a smartphone screen. Sarah had discovered that in the digital realm, she wasn't a caretaker, a student, or a burdened daughter. She was a creator. She was a girl with an audience that didn't care about medical heart pumps or battery replacements. Her obsession with social media influence became a form of escapism that her parents couldn't understand and, more importantly, couldn't stop. She began to live for the dopamine hit of a notification, finding more intimacy in the comments section of a TikTok video than she did at her own dinner table. She told her confidants that the physical world felt like a gray, sterile waiting room, while the digital world was where her real life was waiting to begin. The biological father, Charles Patrick, was the variable the Brocks could never solve. In Sarah's mind, Charles was the liberator, the man who represented the what-if of a life without the heavy atmosphere of the Brock household. While the Brocks saw Charles as a disruption to the stability they had worked so hard to build, Sarah saw him as an ally. She began communicating with him in the dark, late at night, under the covers of her bed, using apps that she hoped would stay hidden from Christine's prying eyes. These conversations weren't just about catching up. They were about plotting a different future. She conveyed to her father that she felt like a prisoner, and that every day spent in Carrollton was a day stolen from her. But the most complex part of the family dynamic was the presence of her 5-year-old sister. The child was a mirror of the innocence Sarah felt she had lost, and a constant reminder of the responsibilities that would tether her to the Brocks for another decade. Sarah watched as her mother showered the toddler with the kind of affection that was now replaced by suspicion and discipline in her own life. The girl represented the next generation of the perfect family facade, a role Sarah was increasingly unwilling to play. The resentment didn't manifest in outward cruelty toward the child, but in a cold, emotional distancing. Sarah began to view the girl not as a sister, but as a component of the machine that was holding her back. By the winter of 2024, the facade was becoming brittle. The tension at the dinner table was a physical weight. James would sit there, the hum of his LVAD, the only soundtrack to a meal defined by Sarah's monosyllabic answers and Christine's sharp, questioning glances. The parents noticed that Sarah had stopped talking about her future in terms of college or church service. Instead, she seemed to be retreating into a private world of headphones and hooded sweatshirts. She told her teachers she was tired, but the fatigue wasn't physical. It was the exhaustion of a person who had spent years performing a character she despised. The psychological pressure cooker finally began to hiss when Sarah's digital life and her physical reality collided. Christine had discovered evidence of Sarah's secret communications with Charles and her inappropriate content on social media. The fallout was immediate. Sarah was stripped of her devices, her movements were restricted to school and church, and the surveillance reached a new peak. For Sarah, this was the final provocation. She wasn't just losing her privacy, she was losing her connection to the only world where she felt powerful. The weeks preceding February 20th, 2025, were marked by a terrifying calm. Sarah stopped fighting back. She became the perfect daughter again, compliant, quiet, and helpful. She attended every church function and assisted James with his medical needs without complaint. To Christine, it looked like Sarah had finally seen the light and submitted to the family's values. But this was a calculated mask. Behind the submissive gaze, Sarah was processing the finality of her situation. She had reached a point where she believed that as long as James and Christine were alive, she would never be free. The hum of the LVAD, once a sign of a father's survival, had become the sound of her own life being drained away, second by mechanical second. The planning was silent. It was a dark, internal monologue that focused on the geography of the house, the timing of the medical alarms, and the absolute vulnerability of her parents while they slept. She knew James couldn't run. She knew Christine would protect him until her last breath. And she knew that the 5-year-old sister would likely sleep through the initial disruption. Sarah didn't see herself as a criminal. In her warped perspective, she was a revolutionary, fighting for her own survival against a system that demanded her total submission. The perfect Georgia girl was gone, replaced by a teenager who had realized that in her world, freedom would have to be taken with a cold, steady hand. The air in the house grew thin, sterile, and expectant. Every night, Sarah would lay in bed and listen to the machine in the next room. Whir click, whir click. It was a metronome for a life she no longer wanted any part of. She began to count the steps from her door to theirs, memorizing the creaks in the floorboards, ensuring that when the moment came, the machine would be the only thing that heard her coming. The dynamic had shifted from a family in crisis to a hunter and her prey, all living under the same roof, sharing the same Sunday meals, and waiting for the silence that only a cold barrel and a pulled trigger could provide. The early hours of Thursday, February 20th, 2025, were defined by a cold, biting Georgia wind that rattled the window panes of the Brock home. But inside the master bedroom, the air was thick with the rhythmic, artificial pulse of the LVAD machine. James Brock was submerged in a deep, medically aided sleep, his life literally hanging by the thin power cables connected to his mechanical heart. Beside him, Christine lay still, the silence of the suburban night providing the only cover for what was moving through the hallway. In the darkness of the neighboring room, 16-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick was no longer asleep. She was a shadow waiting for a timestamp. At exactly 3 a.m., the temperature in Carrollton hovered just above freezing, and the floorboards in the Brock house were cold enough to sting bare feet. Sarah didn't move like a child. She moved with a terrifying, rehearsed precision. She pulled the hood of her oversized black sweatshirt over her head, the same hoodie her 5-year-old sister would later identify in a soft, trembling voice to investigators. The weight in her hand was a .38 caliber handgun, a cold piece of iron that felt heavier with every step she took toward her parents' door. She later told her friends that she didn't hear the house creak. She only heard the whir click of James's machine, a sound she had come to hate with a visceral, jagged intensity. The walk from her bedroom to theirs was only 15 feet, but it was a journey through 16 years of resentment. She reached the door and paused, her thumb resting on the safety of the weapon. There was no hesitation, no sudden realization of the gravity of the moment. According to the digital reconstruction of the crime, she entered the room at approximately 3:14 a.m. The room smelled of antiseptic and sleep. She stood at the foot of the bed, looking at the two people who had spent the last decade trying to save her from herself. The first shot was fired at James. The mechanical hum of the LVAD didn't stop immediately. Instead, it began to shriek. The machine, sensing a catastrophic drop in the blood flow it was designed to maintain, triggered an alarm that pierced the silence of the house. James never woke up. He was gone before his brain could process the metallic heat of the bullet. Christine, however, was jolted from her sleep by the sound and the sudden, frantic beeping of the machine. In her final seconds of consciousness, she turned toward the figure at the foot of the bed. Sarah didn't speak. She didn't offer a goodbye or an explanation. She pulled the trigger again, and then again. The flashes of gunfire illuminated the room in strobe-like bursts, showing a daughter's face that remained as cold and mechanical as the heart pump now screaming in the dark. The shots were loud enough to wake the 5-year-old sister, Jaylee, in the next room. The toddler sat up in her bed, her eyes wide with a confusion she didn't have the words to describe. She heard the loud pops, a sound she later compared to fireworks that weren't pretty. She saw a shadow move past her doorway, heading back toward the master bedroom. But the shadow didn't flee. It didn't run into the night. It walked into the 5-year-old's room. The shadow, clad in that distinct black hoodie, sat on the edge of the child's bed. With a hand that had just felt the recoil of a firearm, Sarah tucked the blankets around her little sister's chin. She told the girl in a low, soothing whisper that the noises were just the machine acting up, that everything was fine, and that she needed to go back to sleep. This moment of chilling care was perhaps the most haunting detail of the entire night. It was a sisterly gesture performed in the wake of a double execution. The child, comforted by the familiar voice and the gentle tuck of the covers, drifted back into an uneasy sleep, unaware that she was now sharing a house with 2 corpses and a killer who was checking her watch. Then began the 90-minute gap, the period of time that would eventually dismantle Sarah's entire defense. From 3:20 a.m. to roughly 4:50 a.m., Sarah Grace Patrick was a janitor of her own crime. She didn't panic. She didn't drop the weapon and flee to her biological father. She went to the kitchen and retrieved a microfiber mop and a bucket of water. She walked the hallway, scrubbing the hardwood floors to remove the faint, invisible traces of her footprints. She worked with a clinical efficiency, moving through the house while the LVAD alarm continued to beep, a low battery warning that signaled the machine was trying to pump blood through a heart that was no longer beating. She returned the gun to its hiding place, a location she believed the police would never find. She then returned to her own bed and waited. She didn't call 911. She didn't scream for help. She sat in the darkness, watching the minutes tick by on her phone, likely checking her social media notifications as she waited for the sun to rise. She needed the discovery to look organic. She needed a witness who wasn't her. As the first gray light of a Georgia morning began to filter through the blinds, the 5-year-old sister woke up again. The toddler, naturally seeking her parents, walked into the master bedroom. She found them cold, the bedsheets a dark, saturated red. She tried to wake her mother, but when there was no response, she ran to Sarah's room. At approximately 7:30 a.m., over 4 hours after the shots were fired, Sarah finally picked up the phone. The 911 call was a masterclass in performance. Sarah's voice was a jagged, high-pitched scream of terror. She told the dispatcher that her baby sister had just found their parents and that they weren't moving. She sobbed so hard she seemed to choke on her own breath, a display of grief that initially convinced the first responders that she was a secondary victim. She played the role of the hysterical orphan to perfection, clinging to her little sister as the sirens began to wail in the distance. When the first deputies from the Carroll County Sheriff's Office arrived, they stepped into a house of contradictions. The living room was quiet and orderly, the church bulletins still sitting on the coffee table. But the master bedroom was a site of calculated carnage. They noted the LVAD machine, its alarm still chirping a dying song, its power light blinking red. They saw James and Christine, shot multiple times while they lay in the vulnerability of sleep. And they saw Sarah, crying, shaking, and asking the officers who could have done such a terrible thing to her family. As the paramedics led the 5-year-old to an ambulance, Sarah stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes scanning the crowd of neighbors that had begun to gather. She looked like a girl whose world had ended, but the investigators noticed something. Despite the hysteria of her 911 call, Sarah's hands were steady. There was no blood on her clothes, no dust on her feet. She was too clean. She was too prepared. The day X of the Brock family had ended with 2 bodies being carried out in black bags, while the girl in the black hoodie was already thinking about her first post to the world as a survivor. The machine had stopped, the hallway was scrubbed, and the performance, a 5-month act that would captivate TikTok and the local news, had just begun its first act under the cold light of the Georgia sun. The yellow crime scene tape had barely been cleared from the porch of the Brock home before the ring light was turned on. In the immediate aftermath of the February 20th massacre, as the Carrollton community gathered in church basements to pray for the orphaned girl, Sarah Grace Patrick was beginning a second digital life. She didn't retreat into the privacy of her grief, she broadcasted it. To the outside world, she was a 16-year-old shattered by an unthinkable tragedy. To the camera lens, she was a content creator who had just found her most compelling narrative. For the 5 months following the murders, Sarah moved into a world of filters and hashtags. She became a fixture on TikTok, under a handle that many followers came to associate with the Justice for the Brocks movement. This wasn't just a girl posting a few photos of her parents. This was a systematic, high-production effort to curate an image of the perfect survivor. She utilized every trend available to the true crime community. There were the "Get Ready With Me" videos, where she would apply makeup with trembling hands, explaining to her followers how hard it was to put on a brave face when your world had been stolen by a shadowy intruder. There were the POV videos where she would sit in the backseat of a car, staring out the window at the rain, set to slowed-down, melancholic pop tracks that signaled a profound, cinematic sadness. The strategy was chillingly effective. In the digital age, vulnerability is currency, and Sarah was spending it in bulk. Her follower count surged as true crime enthusiasts from across the country flocked to her profile, dissecting her videos for clues and offering a level of parasocial support that Sarah had never felt in the sterile atmosphere of the Brock household. She became a tragic protagonist in a real-time documentary. She would answer questions from my followers, carefully selecting the ones that allowed her to reinforce her alibi. When asked if she felt safe, she would look directly into the camera, her eyes welling with tears that seemed to arrive on command, and whisper that she felt watched, hinting that the phantom killer was still out there, perhaps even following her digital footprint. But behind the high-definition glow of her smartphone, the search for the truth was taking a very different shape. While Sarah was busy editing her next tribute video, the Carroll County investigators were conducting a silent, digital surveillance of their own. They weren't looking at her filters, they were looking at her metadata. Every time Sarah posted a video about how she couldn't eat or sleep, the police were cross-referencing her activity with the data recovered from the scene. They noted the orphaned aesthetic she had adopted, the oversized hoodies, the unbrushed hair, the pale, washed-out complexion. It was a costume of grief, designed to evoke maximum sympathy and minimum suspicion. The social echo in Carrollton was profound. The town was divided into 2 camps. There were the believers, mostly church members and school friends who saw Sarah as a miracle and a saint. They organized bake sales and GoFundMe pages to support her and her 5-year-old sister. They wore purple ribbons in honor of Christine and blue ones for James. To them, Sarah was the last light of a family that had been extinguished. And then there were the skeptics, the local residents and seasoned law enforcement officers who noticed the cracks in the mask. They wondered why Sarah never mentioned the specifics of the investigation. They wondered why she seemed more interested in her likes and shares than in the progress of the ballistics report. One of the most disturbing aspects of this interim period was the role of the 5-year-old sister in Sarah's content. Occasionally, the toddler would appear in the background of Sarah's videos, a silent, wide-eyed ghost of the night of February 20th. Sarah would use the child as a prop for her narrative of the last 2 left. She would post videos of herself hugging the girl, captioned with phrases like, "I will protect you from the shadows that took them." To the public, it was heartwarming. To the investigators who knew the child had identified the shadow as Sarah herself, it was a psychological horror movie playing out in 15-second clips. The tension was also building between Sarah and her biological father, Charles Patrick. While she was publicly mourning the Brocks, Her private communications, recovered much later, showed a girl who was already planning her new life. She spoke with Charles about moving to a new state, about changing her name, and about the inheritance she believed was coming her way. The grief she showed on TikTok was a firewall, a way to keep the public and the police at a distance while she waited for the probate courts to hand over the keys to the Brock estate. As the months turned into the summer of 2025, Sarah's performance began to grow more elaborate. She started reaching out to major true crime YouTubers and sleuths, offering exclusive interviews where she could tell her story. She was attempting to co-opt the very community that usually hunts killers. She wanted to be the victim who couldn't be questioned. But the Carroll County Sheriff's Office was moving at a different pace. They were waiting for the lab results from the microfiber mop she had used in that 90-minute gap. They were waiting for the geofencing data that showed her phone's exact movements on the night of the murders. The disappearance and search, in this case, wasn't about finding a body or a missing person. It was about the disappearance of a daughter's soul. It was a search for the moment Sarah Grace Patrick decided that the perfect life her mother and stepfather provided was a cage that needed to be dismantled with a .38 caliber handgun. By June 2025, the digital world was obsessed with Sarah's survival story, but the physical world was closing in. The ring light was starting to flicker. The neighbors began to report seeing Sarah at the mall, laughing and shopping, only to see her post a video an hour later from her bed of sorrow. The mask wasn't just slipping, it was rotting. The very platform she used to hide her guilt was the one that ultimately condemned her. Every video she posted was a piece of evidence, a record of her psychological state and her ability to manipulate an audience. The investigators realized that Sarah didn't kill her parents because she was broken or insane. She killed them because they were the only obstacles to a world where she could be the sole architect of her own reality. The TikTok morning was the final act of a girl who believed that if she could make enough people believe her lie, it would eventually become the truth. But in the quiet, sterile offices of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the data was finally speaking. The 90-minute gap, the scrubbed hallway, and the chilling testimony of a 5-year-old girl were about to bring the performance to a violent, final halt. The investigation into the deaths of James and Christine Brock didn't just happen in the labs or the interrogation rooms of the Carroll County Sheriff's Office. It happened in the cross-section of old-school ballistics and the cutting-edge science of medical telemetry. For months, Sarah Grace Patrick had played the role of the grief-stricken teenager, but while she was curating her TikTok feed, investigators were building a digital cage around her. The intruder theory had been dead on arrival for the detectives, but proving that a 16-year-old girl was capable of such cold-blooded precision required evidence that was beyond reproach. The first major breakthrough was the analysis of the LVAD, left ventricular assist device. In the world of true crime, we often look for DNA or fingerprints, but in 2025, the most reliable witness in the room was James Brock's mechanical heart. The LVAD is a sophisticated piece of machinery that logs every event: battery life, pump speed, and, most crucially, flow interruptions. When the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI technicians downloaded the data from the external controller, the timeline of the murder shifted from unknown to exact. At 3:14 a.m., the machine recorded a sudden, violent cessation of flow, a result of the massive trauma to James's chest. The device immediately triggered a high-priority alarm, a piercing chirp, designed to wake anyone in the house. This data point was the smoking gun. If the murder happened at 3:14 a.m. and Sarah's call to 911 didn't occur until 4:45 a.m., there was a 90-minute void that Sarah could not explain. In her initial statements, she claimed she was woken up by the shots and called the police immediately. The LVAD proved she was lying. With the timeline established, the search for the weapon took on a new urgency. Investigators knew that Sarah had been secretly meeting with her biological father, Charles Patrick. They began a deep dive into Charles's associates and found a distant relative who had recently reported a .38 caliber handgun missing from his glove box. When the relative provided the serial number, ballistics experts were able to match the rifling patterns on the bullets recovered from the Brock's mattress to that specific weapon. Sarah hadn't just found a gun, She had procured one through a back channel, showing a level of premeditation that shocked even the most cynical detectives. The digital forensic team then turned their attention to Sarah's smartphone. While her public social media was a shrine to her parents, her private vault apps, hidden behind a calculator icon, revealed the true Sarah. These apps contained thousands of deleted messages and search queries. The GBI used specialized software to recover her history from the weeks leading up to February 20th. The results were chilling. Sarah had searched for how to disable a home security alarm from the inside. Best place to shoot someone to make it instant. Will a 5-year-old remember what they see in the dark? Can police trace a gun if it's wiped with bleach? This was the blueprint the prosecution needed. It proved that Sarah didn't snap in a moment of teenage angst. She had conducted a feasibility study for her own parents' execution. The messages to her father, Charles, further detailed her motive. She wrote about wanting the freedom of the city and how James and Christine were suffocating her with their rules and his medical needs. She viewed the house as a prison and the LVAD as the warden's bell. But the most delicate part of the investigation involved Sarah's 5-year-old sister. The child was the only other living soul in the house that night. In a series of forensic interviews conducted by specialists trained in childhood trauma, the truth finally emerged in fragments. The girl described the shadow that came into her room. She told the interviewer that the shadow smelled like Sarah's perfume, a specific sweet vanilla scent that Sarah wore every day. The child also noted that the shadow didn't have a face because of the big black hood, but she recognized the voice that told her to go back to sleep. When the interviewer asked the child if she was scared of the shadow, she replied, "No, because the shadow was my sister." The social echo of these findings was explosive. When the news leaked that the LVAD data contradicted Sarah's story, the community of Carrollton, which had raised tens of thousands of dollars for her, felt a collective sense of betrayal. The church members who had brought her meals and prayed over her now looked back at her TikTok videos with a sense of nausea. They realized they had been watching a killer edit her grief in real time. The rumors of a shadowy intruder were replaced by the realization that the monster had been sitting in the front pew of the church all along. The final piece of the puzzle was the microfiber mop. During a secondary search of the home in July 2025, investigators found a hidden compartment in the garage containing a damp mop head and a bottle of high-strength bleach. DNA testing on the mop head revealed microscopic traces of James Brock's blood and fibers from the black hoodie Sarah had been wearing. The 90-minute gap was no longer a mystery. Sarah had spent that time scrubbing the hallway to remove any physical evidence of her movement between the rooms. She had prioritized cleaning the floor over calling for medical help for her parents. On July 12, 2025, the Carroll County Sheriff's Office moved in for the arrest. They didn't find the orphaned girl they had seen on TikTok. They found a teenager who was cold, defiant, and primarily concerned with whether the media would be present for her perp walk. As they handcuffed her, one investigator noted that she didn't ask about her sister or the status of the case. She simply asked, "Is Charles coming to get me?" In the interrogation room, the lead detective sat across from Sarah and played the 911 call, then showed her the LVAD data logs. He pointed to the 3:14 a.m. timestamp and asked, "What were you doing for an hour and a half, Sarah?" Sarah Grace Patrick didn't cry. She didn't deny it. She leaned back in her chair, a slight mocking smile touching her lips, and said, "I was making sure the job was finished." This admission, while not a full confession, was the final nail in the coffin. The investigation had successfully stripped away the filters, the hashtags, and the church girl persona. It revealed a girl who had turned her life into a horror movie, casting her parents as the villains and herself as the tragic hero. The investigation block of this case proved that while technology can be used to hide a crime, it can also be the very thing that speaks for the victims when they can no longer speak for themselves. The mechanical heart of James Brock had one final beat left in it, and it was the beat that finally caught his killer. The 2026 trial of Sarah Grace Patrick transformed the Carrollton courthouse into a battleground between digital performance and forensic truth. As the prosecution displayed the LVAD logs, the mechanical heart's final, desperate shriek at 3:14 a.m., the room fell into a suffocating silence. The 90-minute gap, once a void of speculation, was filled with the graphic reality of a 16-year-old mopping away her mother's life while the machine beeped in the dark. The defense leaned heavily on caregiver burnout and the psychological manipulation of her biological father, Charles Patrick. But the narrative of the perfect daughter was dead. The most haunting moment came when the surviving sister's testimony was played. Her small voice describing the shadow effectively sealed Sarah's fate. In August 2026, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Sarah was sentenced to life without parole. As she was led away, she looked not at the grieving family, but at the cameras, still seeking the gaze of an audience she will never see again. The Brock home is quiet now. The mechanical heart that once dictated the family's rhythm has been silenced, and the ring lights have been packed away. Sarah Grace Patrick sought a life without boundaries, a digital world where she was the only star in a curated tragedy. But the filters finally faded, leaving only the cold, heavy weight of a life sentence. As her sister grows up in a world without the shadow in the hallway, we are left with a haunting truth. Some masks are more dangerous than the face they hide. The feed has ended. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below.